guess it's story time. You know, time for time, that sort of thing. And traceability is very important, as I've said with the previous two videos aimed at Cletus McFarlane with his new aircraft. And any other YouTuber that happens to have an aircraft, there is an art to the science. There really is. You know, there's the theory, and then there's the practice. So what the alliteration, or say the thing that I'm going to use in this art talk here is to demonstrate how much thought and how much feeling and emotion goes into developing a language which is understandable even within abstract art. Now, the traceability being one thing, in that, you know, the London Public Library knows very well where this book is. And they know very well that it's going to come back to them at some point, because this thing is too valuable, right? The paper is so valuable, and you know, this is worth its weight in gold. And so is, you know, the manuals and the flight logs, the MELs, the minimum equipment list, all the stuff that goes with the airplane, because it is that important. Otherwise, we wouldn't go through the rigmarole or the hassle for the tassel, okay? Read between the lines. So let's go to Genesis. Now, the pioneers of Canadian abstraction in the 1920s. Right? Story time. This here, you see this image, would have been in the well, that's 1928, in the galleries at the same time as Futurism and some other avant-garde stuff like Fauvism, and obviously the Group of Seven came before this in the during the First World War. So there's a lot going on here, right? What you see, and when you purchase an aircraft, is just the foreground. There is so much more than Lensmill's store. Of course, I'm making a reference to fabric-covered aircraft, which I also know how to do. We did. Well, it would take a little bit of time to really remember how to make that envelope and put it over the ribbon spar, so to speak. But you know, again, aircraft are very delicate. They are not playthings, right? Until you have them absolutely 110% correct. You know, and if you just ask someone like Patty Wagstaff, you know, what is the difference between a good mechanic and a shitty mechanic? And I'm sure she'll answer that for you. All right. And, you know, I'll say this for the record. I don't drink and work on aircraft. I don't smoke and then work on aircraft. Right? These things are issues. They're reasons for question of judgment. And you need absolute sobriety when working on something that is so important, that, you know, I don't want any questions when this thing is 10,000 feet maximum ceiling in the air. You know, you can only go so high until you meet the sun, and then you're just burning up on re-entry. It's just how it is, you know. And what happened just recently, say with the SpaceX booster that exploded. Well, this was in the news, right? And the cultural influences are absolutely important upon the psyche and the mentality and the ability to make good judgments, good and sound judgments by the person, especially within a position of authority. So if you're not reading, you're not leading. And if you don't know the art, you don't know the aircraft. I know this is intimidating to talk about, and a lot of people have a more laissez-faire or cowboy attitude towards airplanes. But that ain't me, man. That ain't me. I have a reputation to maintain for my future and for my family, because that's how important it is to me. I wouldn't have gone down this road if I didn't give a shit. Is that clear? Thank you. All right, let's move on from this. Canadians were altogether late to abstraction. By 1920, the influence of Cubism and Fauvism had permeated into the farthest corners of Europe, so that the Stockholm and Copenhagen to Budapest and Kiev, artists were spurred on by the whole range of modernist innovations, made even more dizzying by the breakthrough into the so-called pure abstraction of Kandinsky, Malevich, and Mondrian. So Malevich is spelled M-A-L-E-V-I-C-H, and Mondrian, Piet Mondrian, who was, if I remember correctly, is famous for the primary color paintings. And then Kandinsky has all of these interesting stuff having to do with movement and whatnot. True, Canada was far away from the art world centers, and the lapse of a decade or so may not seem long. But other North American artists like Marsden, Hartley, and the Mexican painter Diego Rivera in particular, working in Europe, had already become full-fledged Cubist practitioners held in high esteem by their European colleagues. While on home turf, Arthur Dove and Georgia O'Keeffe had already birthed individual versions of abstraction, not extraction. That was a slip of the tongue. Early Canadian ventures into abstract art in the 1920s and the 1930s were less certain and unusually sporadic and discontinuous. This is not especially surprising. Artists working in a provincial situation often came upon information in fragmented and scattered ways, a reproduction found here, an exhibition seen there. It is also important to remember that while today we have the advantage of hindsight, in the middle of things, in the years between the two world wars, the lines of stylistic succession that became the modernist story were by no means sorted out. Everything was somehow simultaneously present, as Robert Goldwater described in the years between 1920 and 1940. This period that followed the war was under the artistic domination of early Cubism, witnessed styles that were far from uniform. A dispersed Cubism, Surrealism, various directions of abstraction, and symbolism developed side by side. In Canada, it was not until 1923 that Kathleen Munn first exhibited Cubist-influenced paintings in the annual exhibition of the Royal Canadian Academy in Toronto. Bertram Booker's solo exhibition of abstract pictures took place in Toronto in January of 1927, and the first exhibition of international modernism in Canada. Works from the collection of the Société Anonyme in New York opened at the Art Gallery of Toronto 2 months later. Toronto in the 1920s. If Toronto could boast an avant-garde movement in the 1920s, it was the Group of Seven: Franklin Carmichael, Lauren Harris, A.Y. Jackson, Frank Johnson, Arthur Lismer, J.E.H. MacDonald, and Frederick H. Varley. I really like Varley. He's very good. Very good. They had banded together in the first years of the previous decade and dominated art in Canada into at least World War II. They dominated. They dominated. Their artistic mission was not phrased other than the uneasy distrust with a reference to the European avant-garde, but was dedicated to securing an independent and self-confident Canadian art, one that broke free of their predecessors' colonialist dependence on foreign models, and one that confirmed itself as an independent artistic style expressive of the country's native spirit. Most indigenously Canadian was the wild wilderness, so they became landscape painters, dedicating dedicated to working in front of the motif. Even Lawrence Harris, so Massey Ferguson is involved, obviously, who kept his eyes alert to international development, long found it difficult to resist the lure of Canadian landscape. There is no more poignant expression of his hesitancy before abstraction than his letter to Emily Carr, written just after he had returned from a trip to Europe in 1930. A mere 4 years before he finally took his irrevocable plunge into abstract painting. In his words, I cannot yet feel that abstract painting has greater possibilities of depth and meaning than art based on nature and natural forms. As he said so frequently, becoming arid, but of course it need not. I have seen almost no abstract things that have the deep resonance that stir and answers and satisfies the soul. However, so it's something that I haven't found something that quenches his thirst. But that does not say that some painter may not produce them tomorrow or the next day. To you and me and many others, they represent the representational, right? So the physical and the understandable means nothing. The spirit is everything, but we cannot get the spirit without the use of representation in some degree or altogether. It doesn't really matter. So we use the representational because it provides a home for the spirit. And we sense the spirit first and always through life and forms of nature. Committed as they were to an ideology of national romantic landscape painting, the Group of Seven encountered with international modernism, and their official pronouncements on it were a sequence of negatives. Unlike their American contemporaries, they did not have their first significant contact with modernist art at the Armory show that took place in New York in early 1913. With its Cézanne, Gauguin, Van Goghs, its Cubist Picassos, its non-objective improvisation like Kandinsky, and its Duchamps, its nude descending a staircase, the most infamous work of the extravaganza of an exhibition. Instead, they took the inspiration from the exhibition of contemporary Scandinavian art that had opened at the Albright Art Gallery, now the Albright Knox Art Gallery, in Buffalo, New York, only a few weeks earlier in January. Lawrence Harris and J.E.H. MacDonald came back from Buffalo full of enthusiasm about the close correspondence that they had discovered between the spirit with which the Northern Europeans looked at their native lands and how the Canadians wanted to paint their own North. The Group of Seven's landscape program, quite in the ascendancy by the 1920s, was given passionate accumulation by F.B. Husserl's History Come Manifesto, a Canadian art movement, the story of the Group of Seven, published in Toronto in 1926. Husserl's strategy to establish the group's autonomous and indigenous achievement was to delineate, so to make themselves stand out, the two foreign enemies that stood in the way of the development of an independent national art. So, an identity. Before I go on, Canadians, we have this obsession with identity. We have this inferiority complex. We're always trying to prove something. And the comparison, the dynamic between Canada and the United States is always, Canada has always been the underdog in comparison to the capitalist nightmare that the United States has become, instead of the authoritarian that it used to be within this period. Husserl's strategy to establish the group's autonomous and where did I go? Of an independent national art. The first, which has surely already had been defeated by the 1920s, was the colonialist yoke of 19th century Britain and European artists. So the colonialist yoke, so like the egg was laid, and we took it, we incubated it, and we let the bird fly out here. The other newer enemies were Cézanne and his Cubist offspring, whose despotic influence, Husserl warned already, shackled contemporary painting in the United States. Another reason to distrust modern French art. Husserl told his readers in a 1927 article in the Canadian Thesaurus, I don't know what that means, but it's probably something similar to philanthropy, was because it dehumanized art by making it a thing apart from life. Husserl later spoke of Cézannesque painting as one of the phases of modernism that Canadian landscape painters may sometimes have studied but never passed through. So they didn't really care about it. The group's mission in relation to its practice was, of course, fraught with contradictions. Their composition depended largely on 19th century Northern European symbolist models, and much of their bold painterly touch and their uninhibited color were learned from post-impressionism and fauvism. During the 1920s, they may have constituted the Canadian avant-garde, but gradually their rhetoric became parochial, turned self-protective, and self-propagating, and for a long time stood as the bulwark against modernist incursions. The advent of the Great Depeche Mode. Oh goodness gracious! I'm getting some signals here. I'm gonna put a tinfoil hat on my head. All right. Moving on. The advent of the Great Depression contributed to cutting Canadian artists off from contemporary international modernism, and in the United States encouraged a predisposition to local soil and representative styles. This was the direction taken not only by the American scene painters, whose stance was inherently conservative, but of major modernist innovations such as Marsden Hartley and Georgia O'Keeffe, who increasingly turned regionalist and realistic in the 1930s. At the same time, regionalist and nationalist movements did not hold sway in New York the way that they did in Toronto. In New York, Archly Gorky could systemically work through the successive styles of Cézanne, Picasso, and Miro, laying a foundation for the emergence of his own full independent work in the 1940s, and did not do so just by devouring the most recent issues of Cahiers d'Art, but from first-hand experience of the work of modern Europeans, both in commercial galleries and at the Museum of Modern Art, founded in 1929. The upshot was that the young artists in New York had begun to hone themselves on the Parisian-based painting during the 1930s. Were ready to seize modernist leadership away from the Europeans in the aftermath of the devastating World War. But that is running away with the story, because Toronto, during the 1920s, seemed briefly capable of developing, parallel to the Group of Seven's nationalist ideology, a more modernist progressive story. The three main players were Bertram Brooker and Kathleen Mudd, who both ventured daringly into abstraction, and Lauren Harris, who did not, at least not yet, but who all the same acted as an enthusiastic, if finally ambivalent, proselytizer for modernism. So they were apologists, they were salesmen, and they were believers in the craft and each other, sort of thing. They trusted each other because their lives depended on the work. Two of the artists were briefly passed through a kind of quasi-abstraction during the 1920s were Henrietta Shore and especially Lowry Warrener. They deserved at least a mention for having discovered modernism at all. Okay, I got to use the washroom. I'll come back after this cut. Okay, a bit of a costume change here. I got myself a trucker hat for you. But I ain't growing a goddamn fucking mullet. I tell you that much. That mullet stuff, we can let Boomer Gus have that. But some people just don't know when to stop fucking chasing the dragon. They really don't. Fucking snorting drywall dust or some shit like that. Good Lord. Okay. I would love to someday, you know, get this reprinted and have a nice new one, be more presentable and representative of my time at my time at Borden as the tech course. Now there was a great misunderstanding that led to my dismissal from that course, but I would have been valedictorian. I'm telling you, I would have had a medal for that course. I would have. Everyone else thinks that they know what's good for you. And sometimes the hand comes down heavy because there's pressure from higher ups to do so within a chain of command because of knowledge about the person and what they want that person to be. But guidance and counseling are, you know, delicate things. The lightest touch is best when it comes to dealing and nurturing people. Because, you know, if you start getting angry and you start getting vengeful, you start getting arrogant, you start getting pissed off because they won't do what they want, they won't do what you want them to do, or they have learning disabilities, they have dyslexia or something like that, they don't do well in the classroom, or they're just burnt out and they just can't do it anymore. You know, you can come back from burnout, but what you need to do is put yourself into something that's completely different. Right? And now something completely different. Hence, you know, the symbology here. If we're going to talk about abstract art and the concrete here, you know, the steel, the strongest steel, as dependable and durable as steel. You know, it's not just smoke up your ass as the viewer here. I am who I am because of stuff like this. All right. Kathleen Munn, 1887 to 1974. Obviously a woman. And I read this in a book. Munn learned her modernism from the perspective of practicing artists. In this, she differed from both from Brooker and from Harris, who came at it more intellectually. Beginning in 1912, Munn studied regularly in New York at the Art Student League and added summer school in Woodstock. Around 1915 and 1916, between 1915 and 1916, she produced a number of pastoral landscapes with cows, a traditional Dutch and Barbizon subject maybe, but hers were composed as divisionism patchworks of brilliant fulvous color, her palette obeying its own laws, indifferent to representational imperatives. Her closest parallels at this moment were Mondrian's windmills and dunescapes from 1908 to 1909. But this had to be coincidental, for how could she have known any of them? By 1921, her colorful figure dominated painting had, if a little uncertainly, adopted an overlay of Cubist design, a step she had taken not only on the basis of her contacts in New York, but from her personal study of Cézanne and the Cubist sculpture of Henry Gaudier Brazeca, Constantin Brancius, and Alexander Archipenko during a visit to Britain and Europe in 1920. At the Art Students League, she continued her studies with a variety of Cubist-based American artists from Andrew Dashberg to Max Weber and Stanton McDonald Wright, as well as A.S. Balisson, whose work Seated Nude, 1919, Brooker bought in late 1942. Munn's extensive reading, as mystical and occult as that of her contemporaries, included J. Hambridge, a Canadian by birth, who had moved to New York as a young man and who had developed the concept of dynamic symmetry, a theory of proportions based on the analysis of Greek vases and other art of the classical period, in a pursuit of universal principles of perfect structure. Nationalism, this is a quote of Kathleen, nationalism is going out. Provincialism and insularity are less excusable than ever before. We are becoming world-minded, Munn wrote optimistically in her notebook in 1925. A point of view that was quite against the grain of prevailing opinions in Toronto. It was essentially to her lone credit, however, that the modernist-inspired works had a presence on the Toronto art scene during the 1920s, in the group exhibition of the Royal Canadian Academy and the Ontario Society of Artists, and the Canadian National Exhibition, which were the most important venues of the time. The Toronto Mail and Empire on December 26, 1923, reported that in an encouraging, if guarded tone, about the year's RCA exhibition, that Miss Munn had made the first Canadian attempt, so far as local exhibitions are concerned, at futuristic paintings with a Cubist suggestion. So this is what I was saying about, again, Fauvism, Cubism, and then Futurism. Something like that. It looks like a bunch of squiggly lines, but it ain't. Again, if you're not, this is why it's so obtuse and it's so hard to understand abstract art, is because there's so much head games going on, and there's an actual abstraction of the thought with the concept behind it. But if you're not in on it, and if you're not an academic, then it's extremely pretentious. And sometime between 1926 and 1928, Munn experimented with abstraction in two paintings, one of which is untitled, figure 5, so the one that I just showed you, right here. Just lost my... In both, she constructed an erratic space crisscrossed by swooping, gravity-free angular shafts and stripes of twisting white paper and other boldly colored geometric shapes. Colors are sharp and declarative, forms clean and as much invented as merely abstracted from nature, spatial relations unnervingly ambivalent, a kind of painting more freely conceived than anything she had ever done heretofore. And although she stepped out of her usual Cubist mode, she carried it off with no hesitation, but with bravura, bravura, confidence. Not quite landscapes, not quite formal Cubist constructions. They are boldly colored and bristling with muscular energy. But if they are anomalies for Munn, they're also more radical than the paintings that Bertram Booker showed in the Arts and Letter Club in 1927, which were quite revolutionary enough for Toronto. So meaning that Toronto was quite conservative and dull and dreary. Oh, I'm so tired of all this routine. I want something different. I want something more than this suburbia. I don't like the men around here. They're all fancy pantses. I'm going to show them up. Bunch of liars with their pants on fire. I can't believe they're artists. You see, elitism is nothing new. And especially for women, you know, there was always the impenetrable nature, especially within that time, coming about to, say, the first wave, right, which would have been the abolitionists, or I'm trying to remember what their name was, the suffragettes. That's right, suffragettes. And so they were fighting to have some sort of equality, and so Munn would have been a figurehead of that time for that movement. Okay, where was I? The colors are sharp and muscular. See, this is how easy it is to lose your place when you have so much information going through your head. Brooker's exhibition has gone down in history as the first exhibition of abstract paintings in Canada, whereas Munn's abstract paintings did not see the public light of day until they were rediscovered and shown by Joyce Zemens in her 1988 exhibition dedicated to Munn and Edna Tasson. Edna Tasson, because it has an accent underneath the C. A Toronto painter from the 1940s whose work had similarly fallen victim to historical amnesia, forgotten about. Munn's two abstract paintings are different from her other work. However, the more solid geometry, the dynamic movements in space, in ways that support Zemens' contention that this small body work may well have been undertaken in the response to Brooker's own preoccupations over the same years. How and when is difficult to decide precisely because of the uncertain dating of Brooker's work before 1927 and of Munn's two untitled paintings. But however it happened, Munn, in these little pictures, hit on a new synthesis that is really more radical than anything in Brooker's or in her own other work, but which perhaps perhaps because they never found an understanding audience, yielding to no progeny. So that's the thing, right? That's that artist trying to find his audience. This is that old, rise to prominence or rise to power, as Machiavelli calls it. And of course, that's a dark personality trait because people will take it too far, right? It doesn't matter if people love you or hate you, as long as they're talking about you, right? And when people get angry and judgmental very easily, because anger is irrational. It's irrational. Because anger is part of the animal nature of humanity. And anger is not a part of civilization. Anger is part of the jungle world, right? And the aggression. These are why we were called gentlemen, is because we have the capacity to kill and to harm and to maim, but we don't. That's where the fashions of the day, because you got to remember in this time how many war veterans were around, not only because of the First World War, but because of the Boer War and of other conflicts, say with the Suez Canal or whatever it was. And Panama. Panama. Right? And you got to think about the drugs of the time too. And this attitude, once I finish this, I'll get into that, especially because the obsession with novelty and originality. Most of Munn's Cubist work, while remarkable for Toronto, is curiously hybrid, an uneasy and often awkward amalgamation, right, of naturalistic subject matter and an intellectually constructed stylistic overlay. It is as if analytic cubism's facets and angles and chiaroscuro. So chiaroscuro, you should look that up. I don't remember exactly what that means right now. Replied expressionistically, as of course was often the case when cubism was adopted by artists working at an arm's length from the source. So I'm not doing the Roman salute here. I'm just with arm's length. So they're painting the canvas from the position in which it would be viewed from, right? Whereas I personally, I'm up close. I'm very much at a bent arm, like a robot, right? Putting all these layers down, and then I have to step back and see the piece for what it is, the bigger picture, right, from across the room, if not like 100 meters away, right? I want there to be a lightning bolt, lightning bolt, lightning bolt sort of shit going on there. I want them stunned. I want people to be stunned. I want it to mean something. And that's part of the obsession with that moment that artists have and creative people have, that is effervescent, right? It rises to the surface, it bubbles, and at the very best, the cream of the crop, right? Because mediocrity might as well be death to any creative person. It is perhaps not surprising then that one of her submissions is to the invited contributors section of the Group of Seven exhibition in 1928, composition Horses, 1927, Art Gallery of Alberta, probably her most accompanied and graceful work, conveys a pantheistic mood more reminiscent of German Expressionism than French Cubism. Reminiscent especially of Franz Marc, who was represented in the 1927 Société Anonyme exhibition at the AGT by a painting titled Deer in the Forest, now in the Phillips Collection, Washington. Munn's compositions, Horses, succeeded in integrating animals and landscapes into a tightly knit, light-infused composition where forms and content are in perfect harmony. These paintings was bought by Brooker and reproduced in his Yearbook of the Arts in Canada, in which he credited Munn with the thoroughly individual and unique place in the art of Canada. I'm doing an impression of my art history teacher here. I haven't seen that woman since I was in college, and hey, bona fides. I have an art history credit from the University of Western Ontario. So sometimes if I don't include someone, I apologize. Diversity and inclusion. This fucking puppetry shit. I got a hand up my arse, What are you finding in there? Oh my goodness. By then, however, Munn had begun to retreat from her avant-garde endeavors, turning to a series of more realistically rendered nudes in a landscape setting. Throughout the 1930s, she worked on the subject of the Passion of the Christ in an extensive series of drawings in which her cubist stylizations, reminiscent of Mikhail Lorenov's Rayonism, were characteristically less structured than descriptive of mystical emanations of energy and light. Okay, this is going to be another place to stop. I'm going to go to the washroom, and then I'll talk about Bertram Brooker, because this is huge. Oh my gosh. The later pioneers. I can't even get through this whole thing in one sitting. I would have to do another video on Brooker by himself at this point. So yeah, I don't waste people's time. I hope that interests you. And come back for the next art talk. Thanks for watching.